we're going to go ahead and get started. So just to introduce myself, I actually have two back-to-back talks, so I'm just going to kind of take over for the next hour or so, but we will stop in between for questions, and so have like a little bit of a break then, and my second one will start at 11. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Wade. I'm an immersive technology applications engineer with the XRCC team and part of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. I often focus on human-centered solutions, rapidly prototyping different, all sorts of different types of scenarios, and focusing on how do we bring the operator and the operator's needs into the context of our applications. So I've done things that range from environments under the sea, at sea, and all the way up into space, and like medical triage and all sorts of things like that. So I really enjoy taking this technology and applying it to all sorts of different scenarios, learning about lots of different things, and saying how can we really make an impact. And so today, what we're going to be talking about, or this first presentation, what we're going to be talking about is how can we, when we're starting to design our XR experiences, how can we learn from what movies do? Because I'm sure, how many of you have ever seen a movie that has augmented reality in it, or have you ever seen Iron Man, Star Wars, any of those big ones? You've seen something. And so, of course, as we've gone through our development, there's a lot of times where, we'll be in a meeting and teams are talking and we go, oh, well, actually, there was this one movie where there's a shot and they did this one thing, or they had, done it like that, and we pull up images and start talking about it. And, this was something that I kind of do. Some of my team members will know that I just like pull up random images of things, and this is how my brain works. And I'm like, oh, but this one time I saw this thing and that's what we should build. And so I was talking with another one of our developers, and he was like, why don't you do a presentation on this and actually talk about like the fact that we do this all the time? Because in the government, sometimes we say, well, government work, that's not a movie, that's not a video game. Why would we want to do these things? And so the idea here is a little bit less on the developer side, more of before we even start programming, before we hit Unity, before we hit Unreal, how do we design and think about what we want to build and really take inspiration so that we're targeting those different features. So to start off, I'm sure this may look a little bit familiar. This is Ready Player One in 2018. So when we start talking about XR in movies, this is one of the first ones. One of my favorite books. The movie does not follow the book exactly, so I have some feelings there. But an amazing depiction of virtual reality in movies. The thing is like I just said, XR is everywhere, and especially when it comes to the film industry. And there's also some amazing, this talk was going to also include games, and I got about halfway through and I was like, I didn't even include games yet, and I had so much content. So I decided to focus it all just on the film industry of where we can really learn from that. So the big question, like I've sort of already talked about, is how can we learn from and gain inspiration from various films as we go through our experiences. So why do we care? Well, like I already said, it's a great way to brainstorm. What are the things that we want to develop? What are the different kinds of features? You've probably seen a lot of, especially on lower budget projects, we tend to just be like, oh, here's a UI component. Let me throw it up on there. And it's like this gray thing, and it's a little fuzzy because you used a small little image. But how can we break that mold of these clunky UIs and say, how can we do something that really excites our users? That makes them say, wow, I want to use that because it's so much fun to play around with. And then I have this image of Tony Stark just like throwing his hands up there from Iron Man, because if users can do this, and we've actually had some of our concepts do things where users can lift things or expand things in a very fun way that brings like this enjoyment and really engages the users. So how can we make those easy? By seeing things that, generally the things that are in movies are what we as humans are seeing as like, we kind of want our future to be something like this. Or maybe it's we don't want our future to be like this. And so let's, this dystopian environment, let's not do that, right? And so how can we make things that are easy to use, things that we want to use? And then also how can we reduce things like cognitive load where, and you'll see a couple examples here of there's too much information, how can we target this to the right spot? So to start off, let's talk about what are some of the common interfaces or informational displays that we see. And so, of course, I have to start this off by talking about Minority Report. Because other than Ready Player One, this is the one when you say, hey, XR in movies or AR in movies, people go, Minority Report, Tom Cruise, that's the one. And that is one of the earlier examples. We're going to talk about it a little bit more later. But basically, one of the big pieces is we have 2D displays. And so in this case, you see Tom Cruise, he's holding up his hands. He's got all this different information in front of him. But this was in 2002, and actually just this year, Star Trek Picard Season 3, I believe, was released. And they also have a bunch of 2D holographic transparent displays. In that case, they're actually using it to drive a ship, but there's a number of different examples in there. And so what I really wanted to highlight here was that, yes, we're talking about 3D. Yes, we're talking about AR, but there are certain times where we want to use 2D, and these are 2 examples. So where have we done this at APL? Well, last year, I actually kicked off the symposium with Medico. And so this was, if you all saw Crystal's talk at 9:30, this was actually an inspiration for her, talking about how can we use windowed-based displays to present different information. And so in this case, we have the vital signs of a user who's, or the person that we're treating, and kind of like positioned over a body, along with like the rest of the sensor suite and everything there. And so this is just one example of when do we need 2D, when do we maybe not always want to push things into 3D, and this is one of those examples. Now, we're going to mostly talk about AR, but I had to say, well, how can we talk about VR? And so I was thinking, well, Ready Player One obviously is one of the best examples of virtual reality. But then it occurred to me that you could almost call Avatar virtual reality. And so I changed the title of this slide to be, how are we controlling external objects? Right? And so in Avatar, the character Jake is actually able to go into this machine where now he's controlling a physical object. And he's probably using some kind of brain-computer interface or whatever to control it and actually be the blue avatar. But he's able to go through this experience and control this physical object. But in Ready Player One, we see virtual objects, or virtual avatars. And the character there, actually his name's also Wade, he's able to go through and be this virtual avatar that can go and explore different worlds and all sorts of things. And so where have we done this at APL? Well, last year we also talked about mind control. And this was a project that I worked on and Blake Schurz worked on and a few of us on the XRCC team. But there's a few different examples here that also hit that same piece there. So on the left, we have a fully synthetic world. This would be similar to Ready Player One, where basically the user is standing in a fully virtual environment. They're in a VR headset, and they're able to control virtual robots that are able to move around and interact with some things in the environment. But then on the far right, we have the fully real, which is like today's world, where hey, we have some robots and we're just playing around with them and we've got all these devices. But in the middle, that is also similar to Avatar, where we have this synthetic world, the user's in a VR headset, but now we're able to control physical objects that are probably in some remote location at the same time. And so we've combined the virtual world and the physical robots to get that synthetic plus real look. And this is something that I didn't even realize as I was making this presentation. I was like, wait a second, that's actually very similar to the way that Avatar works. And so, moving on, what are some other examples of things that we've seen? Well, location-based AR is extremely popular. We have Free Guy in 2021 with Ryan Reynolds, and there's also a movie called Anon that's on Netflix, and it's a little dark, but they have these white, the interface is like mostly black and white, but they have all of these things tied to buildings. They have like a Greyhound bus fly through a building, and there's like a Red Bull can that sticks out, and all sorts of different things on there. And so you can see that most of these are probably GPS located, but then also tied to physical buildings. So we have thought a lot about this at APL, but what I actually wanted to show was, where have we seen this in the real world in today's media? Well, here's an example of Snap and also Niantic doing something very similar, where we have location-based AR on the Eiffel Tower, and also Niantic is talking about how can we create point clouds of very specific objects and then place AR over top of those. So still saying we have these real-world objects, the AR only appears in that one physical spot, but again, that's something that we're seeing. And so that brings us to when we talk about finally these 3D objects in AR, and what are the things that we can look at. So I threw a bunch of examples on here, but some of these are probably the ones that might jump out to you a lot when you think about XR in movies. One of the most classic ones is the Princess Leia hologram in the original Star Wars. But then going a little bit further, and it was actually really interesting to kind of to analyze these a bit more, we don't really see some of these bigger 3D models until we get to Return of the Jedi, the episode 6 of Star Wars. And you can see that we have a bunch of people all in the same room who are collaborating in this space, talking about how can we, actually that's the moon of Endor with the little red dot there is the second Death Star, and they're viewing this entire thing in 3D. Now, fast forward a couple years, we've got Iron Man and all of the amazing 3D visualizations there. And just like a month or two ago, I was watching the brand new Secret Invasion movie, and what I realized is they have, instead of watching, they like planted a little secret camera in a room, but instead of watching a 2D video, they had it record a point cloud, and now they have a 3D video that's an animated point cloud of everything that they saw. And so you actually, like, as the camera pans, you can see on the backside of the man there is kind of like fading out. That's because the camera picked up the depth as well as also the color of everything that it was seeing and created the point cloud there. So again, these are some examples of where we're seeing 3D in movies. So what are some examples of where we've done this at APL? Well, you know, and as we've seen throughout a lot of these things, the presentations this week, that we have lots of different examples of where we're visualizing models. And actually, for those of you that are interested, you can go visualize the Dragonfly model at our Protospace demo. And so these are a couple examples of where we're saying, well, how can we visualize you know, CAD models or something like that, highly detailed models in AR, similar to these interfaces, right? We've got the Parker Solar Probe there and also Dragonfly. And so that brings us to AR holographic tables. We've looked at a lot of all of these examples, and I'll just throw a couple more at you. So again, we talked about Star Wars, but this time we've got the sort of chessboard there, where they have a bunch of different like monsters that are able to move and attack each other. And then we have the first Avatar and the new one both have some amazing holographic tables. And then there's also another example I found was in Star Wars Revenge of the Sith. They're not just using one hologram, they actually have them all positioned on a table and looking at position that way. Now, instead of saying how have we done this at APL, let's create one. So we're going to step through this a little bit and start to analyze some of these and say, well, really get down to that question of how can we learn from these, right? I've thrown a bunch of examples at you, and it's great to see them, but how do we actually analyze the things that are going on in there? So the first thing that we need to think about when we're creating a table, an AR table, is actually not about the table itself. It's what's in the environment around the table. And so what I want you to do is in each of these, look at not the actual AR experience itself, but what's happening in the environment around that experience. So the top one is in Lightyear, where you have, what is that, 3 or 4 people standing around the holographic table. They're in some kind of, it's a little bit of a darker room, but some kind of meeting space. And we end up seeing that same thing in Return of the Jedi, where now we have all of these people who are in this very large room collaborating over some kind of 3D model. We happen to see that again in The Expanse, which I highly recommend The Expanse. I recently watched it, and it's really cool, and there's some amazing AR visualizations in The Expanse. In this case, again, what we're seeing is they're collaborating around a table. In this case, it's like sort of the bridge / CIC of their spaceship. But they have, you can see it actually juts out from the table, that the hologram is bigger than that it's filling the space a bit more. And then in Avatar Way of the Water, one of the examples was this huge AR table in some kind of like larger warehouse or something like that, but the character's actually walking through it. And so again, thinking about like, what does this environment need to look like? And the reason why we need to think about this is because when we start talking about how we design AR experiences, you often can't really build for the environment. You need to have it in a much more dynamic way. You can say, okay, I know a floor is here or I know a table is here, but you might not know the height of the table or the size of the room or all of those different things. And so how do you start building your AR experience around that? And that's why we need to look at these physical environments so much. And so building this example, I went out to the Unity Asset Store and I said, well, what's a cool environment that I can find? And because EPL does a lot of work in the space area, I said, let's build out like a more sci-fi example. So I went to the asset store and I grabbed this amazing looking space corridors here, threw it into HDRP, and this is what it looked like on the asset store, and I confirmed that, yeah, actually, it did look like that when I brought it into Unity. And so now we've got this sort of collaborative meeting space with this view over Earth. So, okay, we can throw some people in here and let's say that this is where they're working, but what else do we need to talk about? Well, in building a table, we're gonna have data, because that's the whole point, right? It's to read information or how do we visualize this information. So, let's talk about different ways to visualize information on holographic tables. And one of the first ones that comes up is terrain visualizations. And so I threw two pictures on here from Top Gun Maverick. Now these are not XR or holographic tables, but they are some of the most amazing terrain visualizations that I could find in movies, because what they end up doing is stepping through a scenario in 3D and showcasing specific pieces of what the pilots need to be doing in that scenario. And so on the top we have a bunch of contour lines. We have one of them is highlighted. It's probably the altitude that the planes are going to be flying at in that specific scenario, and then a bunch of red points where they had probably like enemy things that could shoot missiles at them. And in the bottom, we have this point of interest with a bunch of like a path of where the plane is going, and again, showcasing that 3D terrain. Maybe in our experiences, we could use something like what James just talked about. If we're in Unreal with Cesium, and now we're saying, well, we've got this whole environment, how do we overlay things on top of that? So again, another really good piece to pull from. But what other examples are there? So in Avatar Way of the Water, they are actually on the bridge of this sort of like flying boat ship thing, and they pull up this experience where they have whales, they have contour lines, and all sorts of things, because they're tracking where all of these beings are like moving throughout the scene. And so this is another way where we can say, well, how are we visualizing the things that are going on in that scenario? And finally, I pull a very different example from Iron Man 2, where actually Tony Stark has the buildings of like some specific area, and he actually like ends up making it vertical and like manipulates it in this super crazy way. But in this shot right here, what he's doing is he expands this out and he's looking at each individual building and how does he need to like understand this on a much smaller scale. So I think the other three are like larger scales about the whole environment and the terrain. That one's more about like the city-based environment. So what are some ways that we can do this? Well, I have basically on here, we're talking about terrain, visualizing terrain in sort of a voxelized way. So voxels tend to be like large or like small little boxes that we can change the size of depending on things. And so on the left here are two examples from the visual effect graph in Unity, where we're basically taking a height map of a terrain, and then we're able to interact with that, change the size, the height, move it around, and do all of these things. We can texture it and color it, or we can make it look super sci-fi and fancy and have some cool lights on there like we have in the top. But where have we seen this in movies? Well, a couple months ago, I saw the Super Mario Brothers movie, and all of a sudden, a table popped up. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. There it is, again, in another movie that you would never expect a Mario movie to have a holographic table, but here we are. And it was actually really cool because they're showcasing the whole world, all of these different environments in there, and you have, again, like we saw before, all of these little toads and everybody in the entire throne room are collaborating over this one little world. And so another great example, just down in the bottom, we have the first Avatar movie where they actually pull up this very specific spot on Pandora, the planet where this takes place on, and it might not be in this shot. There's also another one where there's the very large tree that the movie kind of revolves around. They will visualize that, as well as in this case, like they've got the terrain sloping down and all of those things. I grabbed these two because they look fairly similar. And if I was going to recreate that one from Avatar, this might be something that I would start from and take some references of. So now when we say, well, what are some other ways that we can visualize planets, right? Because we started talking about a space-based scenario. And so maybe we need to expand our scale a little bit more. Maybe we went a little bit too close in, talking about terrain, and we want to have a much larger planet. Well, I brought back that picture of Lightyear because what's interesting about that one is they have people plus this whole dome area. So now we're talking about a much larger environment, but then also the ship that's like floating way off in the distance. And so, is this a way that we could start to visualize a planet? Maybe we don't want to, in this case, they have a dome and it's kind of localized, but maybe we want our world to look like that, where we have like an Earth that's like half cut off. And maybe we're viewing like the terrain from a much more zoomed out scale. In Return of the Jedi, again, we're seeing the moon of Endor there. But again, we have a much larger planet with some details of like the high level contours and things that are on there. And then in the Expanse, we've zoomed way out, and we're actually looking at orbits of things around. It's a sun in the center, and they've got a bunch of different pieces in here, including like areas of uncertainty and a bunch of different asteroids that are floating around. And so now we're talking about, let's say we've got our planet, but what are the other things that are going to be around there? And in Lightyear, there's another really good example of when he's actually in the cockpit of his ship that he's flying. We have a whole planet there, but more so of like the path that he's taking around the planet. So this is like a less detailed view, but it shows you exactly what you need to know. So we're not visualizing all of the data at once, just a little bit. And so when we start to say, well, how are we going to view this? Like I talked about earlier, let's take a planet, or the planet Earth, kind of cut it off a little bit. I wrote a custom shader that basically will clip, for those of you that are developers, it clips any of the vertices that are outside of our specified bounds. So there's this little blue line here, and basically anything that is outside of that, we're going to just not show that. And so we can take our Earth and expand it really big, and then we could actually very easily just kind of rotate the Earth and make it so that this is interactable and you can move it around. So now we have to say, well, what kinds of content do we want to put around this? We've got our environment of the whole physical space we're going to collaborate in. We've got our actual like terrain. In this case, it's just mostly an Earth because we're talking about space. But now we need to talk about the data that we want to show. And so one of the biggest pieces or things that pops up a lot is this talk of like a mission overview or some kind of navigation. And in Star Wars: The Force Awakens, the entire plot of the movie revolves around how do we navigate through the galaxy to find Luke Skywalker. And they're missing a core piece, but at the end of the movie, they fill in this map. And what you end up seeing is they have this whole area where you have the waypoints and places that you need to travel in order to find Luke Skywalker. We see the same thing in Top Gun Maverick, like we talked about earlier, where we have where the plane is traveling, and then we also have the location of the plane plus its planned path going forward in a very different line. And we see the same kinds of things again in the Expanse. I brought up two of them here. On the top, that's the one that we already talked about with the different orbits, and now displaying different types of data where those objects are relative to other things that they're orbiting around. And the bottom one, the Expanse, they're actually planning a bunch of spacecraft that are all coming to like a singular point or location. And we have, again, those types of paths plus the planned paths in the front. You can see it's kind of tiny there, but they have that same sort of dotted line of where the object is and where it's going. So let's throw some of those on our Earth. And now what we have here is we have our path of where things are orbiting around. Let's say we have like 2 satellites that are orbiting Earth, and then down actually on the ground level we have some kind of ground asset. But what we're seeing here, and this is an extremely basic example, but I actually kept this on purpose because what we've now talked about is how do we actually design this, right? It's very easy to say, oh, well, we have some satellites that are orbiting around and whatever, they do a thing. But what we're actually saying is we have the orbit of where it's going, we have the current position and its planned path forward, plus where it is relative to all of the things around it. So we've got our data, we've stepped through all of these and learned about what are some of the different ways that movies have done this. But then we also need to say, well, how do we interact with this, right? Because it's great as a static model, but we really want to understand the full piece. And so I will ask, what does every single movie that we've shown have in common? Well, we're using natural interactions with hands, eyes, or speech. And what we have to say, though, is not all of the movies get it right. And so I actually want to bring back Minority Report because it's very interesting. A lot of people say, oh my gosh, Minority Report, it does all of these amazing things. But me, as somebody who's spent a decent amount of time in XR, my arms would get so tired. If I had to stand there for 8 hours a day and hold my arms up straight out like that and do all of these crazy super fast movements, I don't know how Tom Cruise did that, because he must have had like some really strong muscles in his shoulders to be able to film all of that. And so maybe Minority Report didn't get it right. But what are some ways that feel better, that we want to design for? Well, in Avatar Way of the Water, we have a table, again, where people are collaborating around, but there's two different types of menus here. So we have a physical menu that's actually built into a screen that's right next to the table. And then where in front of the larger Avatar Na'vi character here, we have a holographic 2D display, and maybe, I'm not sure if he does this in the movie, but maybe this is something like we see with like the HoloLens, where we have an AR interactive display where we can actually reach out and use hand tracking to touch different components. So we have a physical menu and virtual menus. And then let's talk about Iron Man, or in the Avengers movies. And so one of the things that always pops up is this HUD-based display that he has, where he'll quickly rotate around and look at a lot of different information. But one of the challenges there is like, what would this actually look like if we built it? It turns out that HUDs, or head-based displays, or heads-up displays, are actually very complicated to build because it's very easy to overload the user with so much information. And I had seen another image capture where he's viewing a 3D model that's like an inch from his face, which does not really make sense. And so if we were to actually step through and try to build this, maybe it doesn't work. So maybe they didn't get everything right in Iron Man, but what are some things that we might want to design for? Well, in some cases, Iron Man definitely got it right. You can see him holding interactions, using his hands to physically interact with them, expand them, make him smaller, get a feel for the objects. And then also in Way of the Water, I mentioned earlier, the character's actually standing inside of the table. And what's really cool is he does this hand motion where he kind of swipes from the left of his side up through the table, and that orange track there, that's a piece that he has highlighted, saying this is the direction of where we want to go. And so now the character is able to stand in the physical table and interact with things in a very natural feeling way, as if they were physical objects. And so just to kind of wrap all of this up, I wanted to add a little challenge statement in here to say, now that you've seen a ton of these examples, how might you take inspiration from movies, TV shows, and games in your various projects? And with that, we have 3 minutes for questions.
One example for you.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, multinational chemical industry would have actually a 3D model made out of toys at scale to show the chemical plant. 20 years later, they put that whole model in 3D in a computer, so you can actually walk inside the piping. How easy, if you have that particular model now, would be to now put that in a hologram on a table? Is that easy peasy, or because maybe they have it now already? I've been out of the chemical industry for a while, but I mean, it would be great to actually have that table with the chemical plant in there.
Yeah.
To model, just to basically work on it.
Yeah, so there's sort of two pieces to that. One is the technical question of like, where is the data coming from? Do we have CAD models of the facility? All of that. And then the other piece is the form factor and of the display. And so I spent about half the presentation on AR tables. And what's really interesting is we see this all the time, and a lot of the physical objects that we're used to, you have to set it down on a table and manipulate it. Whether that's like wargaming scenarios or visualizing data or something like that. What if we put it on a table? And so I wonder if taking that CAD model, and there's probably value in seeing it in the full scale context size, but if you want to make it smaller, do we have it float in the air, or should we look at some of these and say, well, what happens if you put it on a table, have a center point of focus? And a lot of times when you have something on a table where everybody's standing around that center point of focus, it makes it very easy to collaborate and communicate with each other too. And so, again, like how can we take these things and start saying, well, what pieces can we pull out of this? And maybe we want to take our plant and drop that into a scenario that looks very similar to Avatar and feels the same way as Avatar, because maybe James Cameron was onto something. So that is the idea. Yeah, really quick.
I'm not sure if the question is related to this, but in terms of if you were to actually try to deploy this, if you thought about like what headset, because it seems like in the movies everything is always bright and you can see it, and we know if you use the HoloLens, the field is narrow, stuff is not bright.
Yeah.
And I know some of the headsets are now trying to go to a mixed where you can do video pass-through plus the virtual, like, is that how, if you were going to do it today?
Yeah.
You would do it?
Yeah, I think it depends on the hardware. If you're targeting a pass-through, if you have like a smaller field of view, you might want something a little bit more contained. If you have that wider field of view, then like the Expanse could be a really good one where it fills the entire environment. And so, maybe we want to pick our hardware based off of the type of data that we want to display or the type of ways that we want to interact with things. So yeah, with that, we're gonna do like a very quick, maybe 30 seconds, 60-second break, and then we'll jump into the second one.